he gave shelter to one wounded orc. A week later, 500 warriors knelt at his gate, and what she told him that morning would change the frontier forever. Thomas Calder woke before the light, the way he had for 6 winters. He didn't need to. There was no one to feed but himself, no one waiting on the work. He woke early because sleep was a room where his wife still lived, and mornings were easier than staying in it. The forge sat a half-mile outside Briar Pass, close enough that the village could reach him when a plow blade cracked, far enough that nobody had to look at him otherwise. That was the arrangement. Nobody had written it down. Nobody had needed to. He lit the fire, set water on the stove, and put 1 bowl on the table. 1 bowl. 1 spoon. 1 cup. The second chair had sat against the wall so long there was a clean square on the floorboards where its legs used to be. The bed upstairs had 2 sides. He slept on one. The other stayed made. By mid-morning the forge was ringing, a harrow tooth for the Hale farm, 2 hinges for the granary, a wagon fitting for a man who would pay in eggs and leave without saying more than the count. That was how Briar Pass dealt with Thomas Calder. They paid. They left. 6 winters ago, when the fever took a quarter of the village, and his Sarah with it, people had said words like, "We're here for you, Calder." The words had lasted about as long as the casseroles. The only person in the pass who came without needing iron was 9 years old. Pip Thatcher didn't knock. He never had. He came through the gate around noon, with a heel of bread his grandfather sent as payment for a mended latch, sat on the cold anvil like it was a fence rail, and talked enough for both of them. Thomas worked, and let the boy's voice fill the forge the way the fire filled it. Neither thing asked anything of him. Rusk came by our place, Pip said, swinging his boots. Grandfather had to pay the frontier fee again. He said a word after Rusk left that I'm not supposed to know. Thomas turned the harrow tooth in the coals. Magistrate Edwin Rusk collected what he called the Frontier Protection Levy from every household outside the village stockade. There was no bandit trouble anymore. No war party had come down from the mountains in 20 years. But the fee survived, the way fees do. Rusk wasn't a cruel man. He was worse. He was a man with a ledger, and he believed in the ledger completely. Thomas paid it every quarter. It bought him the right to be left alone. That was the whole of his life, and he had stopped calling it small. Fire. Iron. 1 bowl. A boy who didn't knock. A man could stand on that. He had been standing on it for 6 years. Then came the morning with blood in the frost. First snow had come thin overnight, barely a skin over the mud, and the line across the yard was black in it. Drops, then smears, then a drag mark. It went under the barn door. Thomas stood in the yard a long moment with the milk pail in his hand. Then he set the pail down, took the hay fork off the wall, and went in. She was in the last stall, back against the boards. And even sitting, even bled half-white. She was the biggest living thing Thomas had ever shared a roof with. Green skin gone gray at the edges. An arrow stood out of her left shoulder, high above the heart and below the collarbone, and the front of her rough coat was stiff and dark with what she'd lost getting here. Her eyes were open. Amber. Fever bright. Fixed on him. Her right hand rested on the haft of a work knife she did not have the strength to lift. They both knew it. She held it anyway. Thomas had been 11 when the Northern War ended. He remembered the wagons of wounded coming back through the pass, remembered the names read in the square, remembered what the word orc had meant in his father's mouth. He remembered other things, too. That the war had been over for 40 years. That the village hanged a tinker once, when Thomas was young, for less than what was sitting in his barn right now. Sympathizer, they'd called it. The word had outlived the war by a long way. If anyone found her here, he would lose the forge, the house, the half-mile of being tolerated, everything Sarah was buried next to. The orc watched him do the arithmetic. She didn't beg. Later, he would understand that she was past begging on principle, not past it from weakness. But in that moment, all he saw was a creature waiting to hear the price of things. Thomas hung the hay fork back on the wall. He came back with hot water, clean linen, a bottle of the pear brandy he never drank, and the thin iron he used for burning fitting marks into wood. He knelt down at the edge of the stall, in the straw, where she could reach him if she chose to. "This will be bad," he said. It was the first thing he'd said to her. The arrowhead was barbed. He cut, and she made no sound. And that silence was the worst part. Her hand closed on a floorboard until the board cracked, and she made no sound at all. When the arrow came free, he burned the wound closed, and the smell of it stayed in his clothes for days. Afterward, he sat back on his heels, breathing hard, and looked at the arrow in his hand. Below the fletching, cut into the shaft, was a hunter's tally mark. He'd seen the mark before, on men who came through the pass asking about bounties. Someone had been paid to put this arrow in her, which meant someone might come looking for the rest of the fee. He didn't ask. He set the arrow on the workbench in the forge, where he said everything he wasn't finished with. And he brought her water. And he did not ask her name. She should have died the second night. The fever climbed until she talked in her own language to people who weren't there. And Thomas sat up in the straw with water and vinegar cloths and did the only things he knew, which were the things he'd done 6 winters ago, the last time, when they hadn't worked. This time, they worked. On the 4th morning, her eyes were clear. He moved her to the house because the barn couldn't hold heat. She took the corner of the kitchen, back to the wall, facing the door, and he understood that arrangement without being told, and put the cot there without comment. They built the days out of silence. He learned her rules the way you learn weather. She ate only after he had started eating. She never let the knife out of reach, and never once touched it. When he worked the forge, she stood in the doorway, out of the light, and watched. Not the iron, he realized after a while. His hands. She watched his hands the way a smith watches another smith. On the 6th morning, he found his chisels sharp, all of them, stoned and oiled and laid out in order, better order than he kept them in. He stood at the bench a moment. Then he went on with the day and said nothing. And that evening he opened the cupboard and stood there a moment, his hand resting on the shelf where the second bowl had sat untouched for 6 years. Sarah's shelf. Sarah's bowl. And then he took it down and set it on the table without announcing it. And she sat. And that was the whole conversation. Rusk came on the 7th day, 2 men with him, staying by the horses. Rusk came to the forge door alone, with his gloves in one hand, pleasant as a tax notice. Called her. There's blood on the north track. Good deal of it. Runs out about a half-mile shy of your gate. He looked past Thomas into the forge, unhurried. You'd tell me if you'd seen something. Slaughtered a pig, Thomas said, in first snow. Pig didn't check the weather. Rusk smiled at that, and the smile was the honest kind, which was the trouble with the man. You know what came through the passes in my father's time. My whole job, Calder, the entire job, is making sure it doesn't come through in mine. He pulled his gloves on, finger by finger. A man alone out here. No one would fault you for being careless. They'd only bury you for it. He rode off with his men. Thomas stood in the doorway until the sound of them was gone, and knew, the way he knew iron by its color alone, that Rusk hadn't believed a word. Inside, the orc was standing. Dressed. Her shoulder wasn't ready, and they both knew it. Sit down, Thomas said. Nobody's turning you out. She looked at him a long moment. Then she sat. And something in how she did it told him that in her whole life, that sentence had never once been said to her, by anyone she hadn't bled for first. That evening, changing the dressing, his fingers stiff and clumsy with the knot, her hand came up and closed around his wrist. He went still. But she wasn't stopping him. She turned his hand slightly, watching how he folded the linen, learning the motion, the way she'd learned his chisels. Then she let go. Neither of them said anything about it. The kitchen was very quiet, and the fire ticked, and he tied off the bandage with his heart, going like a younger man's, and told himself it was the fire's heat. The way he told himself most things. It was Pip who saw her. Through the kitchen window, the 8th day, come to return a borrowed all. Thomas met him in the yard with his mouth already open around an explanation he didn't have. Pip looked at the window, then at Thomas. Is she your friend? Thomas said nothing, which, with him, could mean anything, and Pip nodded like he'd gotten a full answer. I won't tell, the boy said. Grandfather says the village talks too much anyhow. He handed over the awl and went home. 9 years old. and the only soul in Briar Pass whose silence Thomas never had to buy. On the 10th morning, she was gone. The cot square, the blanket folded, the corner of the kitchen looking as if nothing had ever lived there. No note. He didn't know if she could write. He'd never asked. He'd never asked anything. And now the not asking sat in him like a stone. He stood in the kitchen with the coffee going cold and told himself it was what wild things did, and that he'd known it from the first morning. Then he went out to the forge and found the arrow. She'd taken it off the workbench and driven it into his door, deep into the oak, the tally-marked shaft standing straight out at the height of his heart. He stood in front of it for a long time. A man leaves a thing like that to say something. He didn't have the language it was said in. All he could read in it was, "Gone." That evening, he took the second bowl off the table and put it back in the cupboard and washed the one, and the kitchen was exactly the size it had been for 6 years. And for the first time in 6 years, it felt small. He didn't look for her. He didn't ask along the north track. He went back to the iron because the iron was what stayed. And the days closed over the whole thing like water. Rusk came again 4 days later, alone this time, which was its own kind of message, with a leather folder under his arm. He stopped at the forge door first, looked at the arrow standing out of the oak for a long moment, and something crossed his face that wasn't in any ledger. "My grandfather kept the border in the war years," he said, not turning around. "He used to say the mountain clans leave an arrow in a man's door when they mean to come back for what's theirs." He looked at Thomas then. He never did say whether that was a promise or a sentence. He laid the paper on the anvil, smooth side up, a purchase contract. The Veterans Land Consortium, seal and all, offering for the forge, the house, and the half-mile. A figure fair enough to be frightening, because fair meant they wanted it clean. "There's talk, Calder." Rusk's voice was kind, and the kindness was real, and that was the thing about him. Blood on the track, lights in your barn, a boy who visits you and won't say what he's seen. Talk doesn't need proof. Talk just needs time. He set a pen beside the paper. "This buys you a start somewhere the talk hasn't reached. Sign it while it's still a choice. I can't promise the next offer comes with a pen." Thomas looked at the figure. Then he picked up the pen, and Rusk's shoulders eased, and Thomas held the pen back out to him. "Forge is where it's always been," he said. "So am I." Rusk took the pen. At the gate he stopped and looked back, and for a moment the ledger-keeper fell away, and something almost like regret stood in the yard with them. "I don't hate you, Calder. I want you to know that. For after." Then he rode for the village, and the first snow that meant it began to come down. Thomas stood in the yard a while after. Then he went to the door and put his hand flat on the shaft and left it where it was. Promise or sentence? It was hers. He would not be the one to take it down. They came on a gray morning 6 days after that. Rusk, 8 men with steel caps and cudgels, and a wagon for Thomas's goods, which was the detail that told him everything. You don't bring the wagon unless the question's already been answered. Rusk read from the order without meeting his eyes. Harboring an enemy of the crown, a witness placing a creature of the orc kind at this property, forfeiture of land and holdings, removal, effective immediately, resistance to be recorded as. The ground moved, not thunder. Thunder ends. This came up through the frozen mud in a slow, steady beat, into the boots, into the teeth, and the 8 men went quiet, one at a time, and the horses began to pull at their lines. Down off the mountain, out of the tree line where the north track bent, the frontier itself seemed to be walking. 500. They came in column and spread into rank without an order given, without a horn, without one voice raised. And that silence was the terrible thing, worse than any war cry. 500 sets of boots, and not a word among them. Work leathers and travel cloaks, gray and green and iron. They stopped at his fence line, in a formation older than the village, older than the crown the paper spoke for, and stood. At their front walked a figure the men of Briar Pass would have called a war chief, and been close. Iron rings at the wrists, a mantle of gray wolf across the shoulders, and under it, where the mantle parted, a shoulder freshly scarred. high, above the heart, and below the collarbone. Behind him, one of Rusk's men said a word that might have been a prayer, and under his own heartbeat, Thomas heard the old border keeper's words, "Come back to collect." They leave an arrow in a man's door when they mean to come back for what's theirs. Thomas stood in his yard with his hammer hanging from his hand and forgot it was there. Then the front rank knelt. It went through 500 like wind through wheat, the creak of leather, iron ringing softly on stone, rank after rank going down, until the only things left standing on that field were 8 village men, a magistrate holding a paper, 1 blacksmith, and her. She came through his gate, past him, to the forge door, where the arrow still stood in the oak, and she closed her hand around the shaft and pulled it free in one motion, and turned, and held it out to him across her open palms, like something being returned to its maker. "You took this out of me," she said, her voice carried without rising, the way a bell doesn't have to shout. "You asked no price. You asked no name." Her amber eyes went, briefly, to the paper in Rusk's hands, and Rusk's hands lowered it. "My name is Morwen Ironfang, war matriarch of 500. My people count a debt of life above every other law we keep." She looked back at Thomas. "You are owed. This clan will stand where you stand, as long as one of us can." Thomas looked past her at the kneeling field. Every face was turned to him. 50 years he had lived, and no one had ever knelt to Thomas Calder. And now, the whole gray morning was on its knees. And all he could think to look at was her. He took the arrow. Behind him, he heard the wagon turn. Nobody had ordered it to. Rusk folded the paper along its crease, put it inside his coat with the care of a man retiring something, and mounted. And the 9 of them went back down the road, at a walk that wanted very much to be a trot. He did not say a word. There are mornings that end a ledger. Rusk was pragmatic enough to know one. That first night, the clan's cook fires burned the whole length of his fence, and Thomas stood at the kitchen window long past midnight, watching them, and did not once think of sleep. They stayed 3 days, camped along his fence line, and the frontier came apart quietly and reassembled itself around a new fact. The clan's offers came through Morwen, and they were not small. Mountain iron, a lifetime of it, or better than anything the lowland traders hauled. Cattle, guards for his road, a place at the clan fires, a seat cut for him in the stone of their hall. Him, a lowland smith with 1 bowl in his cupboard. Thomas turned nearly all of it down. "I didn't pull an arrow to be paid for it," he told her, the second evening, the 2 of them at his gate with the cook fires burning down the fence line like a row of small forges. "Start taking payment now. It turns into something that was for sale." Morwen was quiet a while. "The debt stands whether you collect or not. That is not yours to release. It is ours to carry." "Then carry it," Thomas said. "Just don't hand it to me and cattle." Something moved at the corner of her mouth, the first he'd ever seen there. It was gone by the time she looked at him again. But he'd seen it. That night, late, the fires along the fence burned low, and Thomas woke to voices. Not raised. Orc voices don't rise the way lowland voices do, but hard, and many, and overlapping. Through the window he could see a ring of gray-braided elders standing at the largest fire, and Morwen in the middle of the ring. Alone. Answering them, one at a time. He couldn't understand a word of it. He understood the shape of it fine. He had watched a village council once decide what a man was allowed to keep. She never told him what was said. He never asked. But at dawn, the elder's fire was cold, and Morwen stood at the fence line, facing the mountain, and she stood there a long time. He kept only the iron, and only at a fair trade. Because a smith refusing good ore is not principle, it's spite. Word came up the track that same week, third hand and grinning. The bounty on the mountain clan had been quietly withdrawn. No hunter alive takes a contract against someone 500 warriors stand behind. The village transformed in a week. And the transformation was the ugliest thing in the whole affair. The same doors that had been shut 6 years now sent bread. Men who hadn't crossed his gate since the funeral came to stand in his yard and say loudly that they had always said Calder was the best of them. The granary offered him a contract at double rate, A woman who had crossed the street to avoid him for 6 winters brought a pie and asked, sweet as clover, whether the orc folk might have any interest in hiring honest carters. Thomas took the bread and the pie, because Sarah had raised him not to waste food, and gave them nothing else. The same nod, the same 3 words, the same closed gate. He knew exactly what had changed. And it wasn't him. Pip came at noon like always, not knocking, and sat on the anvil, and asked whether orcs got snowblind, and whether 500 was more people than lived in the whole pass, and whether she was staying. The same boy, the same fence rail perch, the same voice filling the forge, the only person on the frontier whose behavior 500 warriors had not altered by 1 degree. Thomas looked at him a moment longer than usual, and then went back to the iron. And if his eyes stung, it was the forge smoke. Which is what he'd have said, had anyone asked. On the 3rd evening, the clan broke camp. Morwen came to the forge door while her 500 formed up on the track, and the 2 of them stood in the doorway, where she used to watch his hands. "The mountain needs its matriarch," she said. "I'd expect so." Silence. The fire ticked. There was a question standing in the doorway with them, plain as the anvil, and she did not ask it. And he did not answer it, and they let it stand there, because some things die if you name them too early. She looked once at the door, at the hole the arrow had left in the oak, a clean, dark socket at the height of his heart. Then she walked down through his gate, and the mountain took its 500 back, and the ground settled, and the frontier went quiet. Thomas left the hole in the door. He told himself it was because oak putty was a waste of coin. Winter came on full. The forge rang. The village waved now when he drove through, and Thomas nodded back with the same economy he'd always kept. And life reassembled itself into its old shape. 1 bowl, 1 cup, early mornings, except the shape didn't fit anymore, the way a boot doesn't after another man has worn it. He caught himself listening. He was 52 years old, and he caught himself, evenings, listening to the road. The arrow lay on the workbench, where everything unfinished went. On a hard frost morning, breath standing white in the forge, he heard it. Gravel, under a footstep too heavy for any villager, too even to be a horse. 1 set of steps, no column behind it, no drums in the ground. She stood at his gate in plain work leathers, no mantle, no wrist iron, no 500. A single pack over the good shoulder, boots worn down to the welt by more days of walking than the mountain road accounted for. Snow in her hair. She had walked out of the mountain the way anyone walks, as one person, going somewhere on purpose, carrying whatever it had cost, and not putting it down. Thomas came out of the forge wiping his hands and stopped, and the 2 of them looked at each other over the fence his fathers had built. Her wrists were bare. Where the iron rings had sat for years, there were bands of paler green, like the mark a ring leaves on a hand, or a shackle. She saw him see it. "They kneel to my sister now," she said. 4 words, for a mountain, a title, 500, and whatever the ring of elders had cost her. He didn't ask why she'd come. She didn't explain. It was the barn all over again, run the other direction, and they both knew the rules of it by now. No questions, no price, no name given to the thing until the thing was ready. He opened the gate. She crossed the yard and stopped at the forge door, at the hole in the oak, and put 1 finger to it, briefly, the way you touch a scar. Then she went past him to the workbench and picked up the arrow. The tally-marked shaft, the whole story of it. Hunter's fee and fever and 10 days and 500. And she looked at him once, and he didn't say anything, and she dropped it into the forge fire. The fletching went first. Then the shaft took and burned. And what a bounty hunter had been paid to put into her went up the chimney of a lowland smith as a thin gray smoke. And the debt, the law, the whole architecture of owing, none of it survived the coals. What was left standing in the forge afterward was only what had been chosen. They worked that day. She had a smith's eye, it turned out, and hands that learned faster than any apprentice he'd ever cursed at. And by afternoon, the forge rang double. 2 hammers finding each other's rhythm, the way hammers do or don't. And theirs did. Pip came at noon and did not knock, and stopped dead in the doorway, and grinned like a lantern, and said nothing for once in his life, and stayed till dark. That evening, Thomas set the table. 2 bowls. He put the second one down without announcing it, the way he had the first time. And she sat, back to the wall, facing the door, and outside, the snow came down on Briar Pass, and the mountain, and the half-mile in between, covering all of it the same. The fire ticked. The bowls steamed. Outside, the snow kept falling on the village that had shut him out, and the mountain that had knelt to him. And inside, there were 2 bowls on one table. And that was the whole of it. Some debts are paid in gold. The rarest ones are paid in choosing to stay. If this story stayed with you, there are more waiting on the Orc Honor. Subscribe, so the next one finds you. Leave a like if Thomas earned it. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and what you would have done. That morning, the ground began to shake. I read every one. And don't leave the fire just yet. There's another story on your screen right now. Click it. It's worth the stay.